Good evening. Welcome to the Impact of Climate Change in Chicago and Illinois, empowering our local municipalities to fight for a sustainable future. I'm Donna Limper, Issues and Advocacy Chair for the League of Women Voters of Roselle-Bloomingdale. Climate change is a serious threat facing our planet and our nation. However, it is local communities that experience the consequences of environmental policies. Tonight's presentation will explore the intersection of climate science and local government action. We have four impressive speakers tonight. First up will be Donald Wuebbles, Professor of Atmospheric Science at University of Illinois. Dr. Wuebbles is an expert in atmospheric physics and chemistry with over 500 scientific publications related to the Earth's climate, air quality, and the stratospheric ozone layer. His analyses on climate impacts, potential resilience, and societal responses are relied upon in setting both national and international policy. He was a coordinating lead author on several international climate assessments that resulted in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. In short, he's a big deal in the climate world. Professor, please take us away.
Thank you, Donna. I'm happy to be here and hope I can help people learn a little bit more about this issue and why it's so important to us. But tonight I'm going to particularly focus on Illinois, and I'm going to share my screen. What happened to my slide? There it is. Okay, so we're going to focus in on Illinois and particularly the special assessment of the impacts of climate change on Illinois that was published in June by the Nature Conservancy. I led this assessment along with Jim Angel, former state climatologist, and we had 43 other experts that were involved in this as well. And it was very, very kind of the Nature Conservancy to then publish it for us. This is something I had proposed about 2 years ago, and they were kind enough to accept. So what is happening? The climate of Illinois, as well as the rest of the world, is changing, and it's changing very rapidly. In fact, if we look at what's happening globally, it's changing about 10 times more rapidly than nature tends to change the climate system. So this is a very big deal and very essentially unseen before in human history. So severe climate, it's not just about temperature change, it's not just global warming as we tend to hear in the media. It's really, for us, about severe weather changes and the fact that severe weather is becoming more intense. If you live near coastlines, you'd be worried about sea level rise as well. And why is this happening? Well, it's largely happening because of human activities. In fact, almost entirely because of human activities. And the evidence of that is very strong. I won't really go into that today. Now, one thing we can say is that Illinois' climate is expected to continue to change over this century with significant impacts on urban and rural communities and sectors. I'll talk a little bit about that today. So far, over the last 120 years, we've seen about a 1.8 degree Fahrenheit increase in the Illinois average temperature. That's about the same as the global average temperature, by the way, 1 degree centigrade, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. For us, different than what's going on in most places of the world is that's mostly happening at nighttime. We've seen an increase during the daytime, but it's much smaller than the nighttime changes. And the reason for that is, we'll talk about this, there also been an increase overall in precipitation. So we have higher soil moisture, and various studies have shown that that increase in soil moisture is actually kind of held down daytime temperatures in several states in the Midwest, particularly Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri. And as a result, we see most of the big time changes happening at nighttime when there's less impacts of air on particles as well. Looking at precipitation, as I mentioned, we've seen about overall about a 10% increase in precipitation, maybe a little over that. And it's kind of spread fairly evenly through the year, though it's fall and summer overall have seen the largest increases. Now, those are a little different than what we expect as we continue on with the changes in climate, as we'll see shortly. Now, I've already mentioned the extreme events and that they play such an important role. Well, generally, heat waves are increasing in number and intensity. You have more hot days than we've had in the past. And also, cold waves are generally decreasing. And that doesn't mean we don't have cold days or cold waves, but we tend to have less of them than in the past. I already mentioned more precipitation is coming, but in fact, it's actually coming as larger events. And that's because a warmer atmosphere actually holds more water vapor. That's basic physics. And as a result, when it rains or snows, it's more likely to be a bigger event than it was in the past. And so for some places like us, we got more risk of floods than in the past. We'll see a little bit about droughts for us this graph was actually, or this entire slide was made for the National Climate Assessment. So some of these things don't apply to us quite as much so. However, tornado activity is more variable than in the past. And then we've already seen an increase in outbreaks, but the intensity of tornadoes is not really expected to increase. Now, as we look at the future, scientists look at a range of possible scenarios for what that future might hold based on how we continue to use fossil fuels, particularly energy and transportation system, and also land use change, towards then saying, well, what the future going to be like. The red line here, the top line, basically is and this is for carbon dioxide, and you can use similar things for all the other gases that are emitted that matter to the climate system, gases and particles. We've been following that red line fairly closely until recently. We kind of dropped off a little bit from that over the last few years. What we really would like to do is get all the way down to the green one, which is where we would have a 1.5 degree centigrade. You've been hearing about that from COP26. That's what we have as a goal through the Paris Agreement. And so the idea was to get below 2 degrees, which is the blue line here for the emissions, and try to get to the green one. That calls for net zero emissions by 2050. As we're hearing today, that's not likely going to happen, but we still hold out some hope for that. More likely, it's going to be something like the orange or between the orange and the red one, which is going to result in changes in climate of an extra 3 to 5 degrees or 3 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 to 5 or 2 to 5 basically in centigrade. So keep those in mind, because we're going to look at the high scenario and then the orange one, which is kind of the in terms of the emissions here, that corresponds to a low case, because the low case may be the best we can achieve, and but we're holding out hope we can get to one of the other ones. Now, if we look at Northern Illinois, I'm going to kind of focus in on Northern Illinois as much as I can, and including the Chicago area, and looking at mean temperature. I've already said, seen on the order of not quite 2 degrees. Well, we can expect if we follow that lower scenario, we're going to see another 4 degrees or so Fahrenheit on top of that. And in terms of average temperature by the end of the century. And if we follow the high scenario, which I don't think will happen, but it is possible because of feedbacks in the climate system. Even if humans are already trying to move away from fossil fuels, there are other things that could lead to that. There we're talking about 8 or 9 degrees Fahrenheit increase. Now, to understand why these matter, the last ice age was about 10 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit colder than now. And at that time, over Northern Illinois, or even here, Central Illinois, we had thousands of feet of ice over us. So 10 degrees is really huge in terms of a change in climate. So even a few degrees, where we're at now, is actually really important. It doesn't sound like much because we see such large variations in our temperature every day, but this is averaged over the entire year and over the region. And so it it really is much bigger deal than it sounds like to have that, those degree changes. So we're talking about a huge amount of warming if we follow that high scenario, or even the lower scenario. Is going to be a pretty big change for the state of Illinois. Now, looking at rainfall, we can expect on the order of another 10% increase in precipitation over this century. Pretty much doesn't depend which scenario. And there's going to be a little bit variation. The higher scenario is going to give a little bit more. And generally that's going to happen during winter and spring and fall. And summers may be somewhat drier than now. Well, I'm a farm boy from Southern Illinois originally, and then went to the University of Illinois for my education in engineering in those days. And I know that farmers really care about how much precipitation they get in the summer. So if it's going to be drier, that in the summers, that's going to be a big concern. Now, if we look at the days above 95 degrees, that's an unusually really warm day in Northern Illinois. Does happen, 4 or 5 or so times each year, a week or so. And but if we look at the projections, by mid-century, we're talking about 20 of those kind of days, but with the lower, so maybe double the amount with the low scenario, and maybe 30 or more with the high scenario. We're showing uncertainty ranges here because of the differences in our understanding of the feedbacks in the climate system that could impact upon just what those look like. And by the end of the century, we could see, easily well over a month in the lower case of those 95-degree days, and 2 months with the higher scenario. Very different climate than what we're used to. If we look at 100-degree days, we see a similar thing. What is very, very unusual to see a 100-degree day in Northern Illinois almost becomes common, with maybe 30 days or more in the high scenario by the end of the century. At the same time, the days with freezing days are likely to decrease dramatically by a month or more with the lower scenario, and several months with the higher scenario. Now, all these analyses really show you it really does make a difference what we as humans do with emissions for the future, because which case, and this really depends on what's happening throughout the planet, so it's not just us here in Illinois or in the United States, it's what's happening everywhere. If we can get together and greatly reduce those emissions from the higher case, then it will make a big difference in what kind of climate we have. Now, looking at extreme precipitation events, we expect more of those events to continuing to increase over the coming decades. This is looking at 5-year on the left, looking at every 5 years and showing there's been an overall increase. And that kind of rate of change is expected to continue, such that by mid-century, expect 30 to 40 or so days of high precipitation, greater than 2 inches, and by the end of century, even more than that, maybe approaching 60 days. And with the high scenario case, even much more so, even getting up to 90, a quarter of the year or more, having such high precipitation days. Now, what does all this mean? I'm just going to show you one of the sets of impacts. We also looked at agriculture, effects on hydrological systems, on rivers and such, and also on so agriculture, ecosystems, and hydrology. But in this case, it's public health. All those kind of changes I show in terms of heat, water, corresponding increases in pollution because of the increase in heat, tend to lead to a variety of different human health effects, some associated with the dangers associated with flooding and such. But on top of that, we also can expect an increase in vector-borne diseases, both for viruses and for bacteria. This just shows 2 examples of what has been seen already in terms of increases for West Nile virus and for, oh geez, I can't think of the name of it right now. But it's one of the viruses that is Lyme disease, sorry. That's really, really important. On top of that, things like pollen are likely to increase. Weeds ends up really love the increase in CO2 and changes in temperature. So things like pollen are likely to increase and be even a larger problem. This just shows some of the recent past trends showing that we're seeing an increase in the Midwest and such things. Now, what can we all do? We have three options. We can mitigate, reduce the emissions, so we stay at one of those lower emissions cases, hopefully all the way down to the 1.5 degree case. We can adapt, take measures to reduce the adverse impacts on our human systems and on natural systems as well, or we can suffer. And right now we're doing some of all three. And if we're going to minimize suffering in the future, that can only be achieved by doing a lot of mitigation and a lot of adaptation. So those are things we need to concentrate on. What about us as individuals? Well, probably the single most important thing any of us can do is speak up, communicate, let our representatives, whether they're local or national or state, know that this is really important. And the same thing for influencing our friends and family and voting with care. But on top of that, there's a lot we can do to be more energy efficient in our own lives without really affecting our lifestyle. And this is just some of the ways of things that can be done. I don't want to leave us totally depressed about this. We can deal with this problem. Our future does depend on how we act to limit climate change. And I'm really concerned about our children and our grandchildren. We also need to be resilient. Adaptation is not a choice. Our choice is whether to adapt proactively or respond to the consequences. But I also think we can draw on our long history of responding to changing conditions on our planet in facing the challenges of climate change. We need to protect our home. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I'm going to ask a quick question. So we're looking at Bill Gates' notes after the climate summit, and he was saying that he was kind of happy that there were different people at the table, but he also talked a lot about innovation. I know that University of Illinois is a good innovator, and here in Illinois we have the Argonne National Laboratory and things like that that develop batteries. Do you, as a professor at Illinois, are you aware of innovations that could help us either with mitigation or adaptation?
There are a lot of things to be done. In fact, I'm trying to work on nature-based solutions myself. And for the Chicago area, we're working with the Walder Foundation and trying to look at that. So any ideas are welcome, but we'll evaluate them with our models and our capabilities. But there's lots of innovation going on, and I think it just needs to have the right focus to be able to achieve what we need. And so that's kind of how I'm kind of orienting a lot of the rest of my career towards how do we translate science to, so the science of climate change to how do we get to solutions. So I'm very interested in that whole entire question.
Yeah, thank you. Our next question is from Jeff Garris, and he's asking, can we attain a low emission scenario while accommodating economic growth?
The answer is yes. Various studies have shown you can do that we can certainly have economic growth, but it will cost us something to make those transitions. But on the other hand, there's a lot of new jobs and a lot of win-wins. We essentially eliminate air quality issues if we transition away from the use of coal and other fossil fuels. And that improvement in health alone will help pay for a lot of the issues. So we have a whole lot, there's a whole series of analyses that have shown that yes, economic growth is certainly possible and in fact likely.
I'm going to ask another one. In terms of the regional plan that Edith Makra is going to present in a moment, even though climate, clearly we all have to work together across the whole globe, if such a regional action plan is implemented quite profoundly, could you see regional adaptations that might be better than areas of the country that don't do such a thing? Or are we suffering at the, if we do all this great stuff, we're still going to suffer because everybody else is not doing it?
Well, we're going to suffer if people in the world don't reduce their emissions, that's for sure. So we all have to agree to reduce emissions. There's no question of that. In terms of adaptation, I think we're learning from each other as to how we can do adaptation. And I think there's many things we can be applying here in the Chicago region, in the state of Illinois, and the Midwest, that we already know what to do, and that we can also learn from what others are doing. So that's kind of where we're aimed at right now.
Thank you so much, Professor. We are so appreciative of your expertise and your time.
Well, thank you. Bye-bye.
We have 3 more speakers tonight. Next up is going to be Edith Makra. She is Director of Environmental Initiatives for the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. Ms. Makra will share the caucus's 2021 Climate Action Plan for the Chicago region, which is one of the first regional climate plans in the United States. Edith?
Thank you so much for having me and for setting up this this opportunity to speak. And I think he's left, but it's such an honor to follow Professor Wuebbles, who has been a mentor to me. He didn't tell the story, but I tackled him. I went to a public event at Naperville High School. Someone else had organized for Earth Day, and I said, we have to talk. I have this regional approach. So he's really been an important collaborator to us on the climate plan and for the Mayor's Caucus. So should I just get started, Donna? And
yes, please go ahead.
Okay, great. So I will start by introducing the Mayor's Caucus and where we come from in our region a little bit. Are my slides showing okay?
Yes, they look great.
Super. Okay, so just to introduce the region, first of all, the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, we're a regional council of governments. And to League of Women Voters members, you probably know some of the councils of governments are COGs. Ours is the DuPage Mayors and Managers. I live in DuPage as well. And there are other COGs that are a part of the Chicago region, and the Mayor's Caucus is umbrella to all of these COGs. So that's where we come from. And our region is very diverse. It's 8.9 million people, and the communities range, they're just incredibly diverse in terms of size, from our smallest community of Burlington, less than 700 people, to the city of Chicago at 2.9. And the opportunity that we have is to work together. We started out with a sustainability approach to try to find commonalities across these jurisdictions and improve the quality of life. So that's where we come from at the Mayor's Caucus. And what I want to do tonight then is talk about the background and context for this regional climate action plan that we worked on and just launched in July. So this is new work as well. I'll go over the goals, targets, and objectives of the plan and strategies very briefly. I'll spend more time on goals, targets, and objectives because there's fewer of them. The plan is very robust. It's 126 pages. So we'll just be doing the high points. And I'll talk about what the caucus is planning to do to engage with local leaders, our constituents, in engaging and supporting the CAP. So first off, to start with the framework that really laid the groundwork for the climate action. And this is the Greenest Region Compact is our sustainability pledge. And this comes from the need, as I pointed out with that first slide looking across the region, to try to align the municipalities around sustainability. And to do that, the Greenest Region Compact was built on trying to find out what municipalities would like to do and what they're capable of doing. And so the goals for the Greenest Region Compact were derived from this research of municipal sustainability actions. I consider it very sensible and achievable. The compact is the first part of that then, and that is, if you will, the political portion of it. All of that research that we did into what's possible, we rolled up into a 2-page document, which is a set of goals, 49 basic sustainability goals in 10 categories. And we asked for local governments to endorse the goals. And that is just it's 2 pages. It's easy enough to evaluate and to support, but it is something that requires local government action, not just a mayor's pledge, which is a little bit more enduring. The next part of that, and then as you can see, there's 134 municipalities. We wrote it for municipalities, but counties asked us to join. So we're very proud to have 4 of our 7 counties in the region participate, in all 10 of our regional, sub-regional councils of governments on board with the Greenest Region Compact goals. No cost to participate. It's just a matter of voicing commonality and unity behind sustainability. The next part of that, all that research that we did lives in a standalone document that offers a very broad range of possible actions that come from that research for achieving sustainability. And that document in itself guides municipal sustainability planning. And as I get into the climate action plan, that Greenest Region Compact framework, that approach of being sensible and achievable, comes forward into the climate action plan. So it has a flavor of the Greenest Region Compact. And then finally, the last step for the Greenest Region Compact is to collaborate to achieve goals. And that's when we work together across the region with municipalities that want to achieve, work on projects together. We do that, and we've got some good successes, which I won't take time to get into tonight too much, but I will count among the successes is the ability that we had to develop this regional climate action plan. So the fact that we have this very strong, robust collaboration, the largest in the country, of municipalities aligned to achieve common goals related to climate, the fact that we were ready for this, and also a little bit of my discomfort with watching some of the all of the resources that in the years that I was watching climate planning go to large cities, that I had some frustration with looking to what my suburban municipalities and the mayors that I work with across the region could do on climate. And I felt like we really needed some assistance. And at the same time, I was looking for support. The Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy is a global organization supported by the European Union and Bloomberg Philanthropies and others, sets a framework for climate action that is used by cities. It's 10,000 cities across the region. And if you look at the global map, the cities that are participating are the ones in green. What was unique in growing was the yellow dots on the map, which are the regions. So there were these regions that were collaborating on climate for the idea of achieving economies of scale and addressing climate issues that bridge municipal boundaries. So they the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy wanted to try this out in the United States. So we were ready to be selected as one of those 4 pilot regions. And this is only in 2019 we started this. So with 3 other metro regions, we embarked on a 16-month journey to create this regional climate plan. And there was no outside funding for this. It was a technical assistance program only. So we were able to attract some tremendous partners, most notably NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, is the lead co-author with me on the plan, and they particularly help with the adaptation portion of the plan. Don Wuebbles brought in his team from University of Illinois, as well as Argonne National Labs. We worked with a Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, who did tremendous work in particularly climate risk and vulnerability assessments. And just as we were starting this project, of course, we had a couple of meetings with stakeholder engagement before the pandemic and the shutdown, but we continued the development of the plan and strong stakeholder engagement across the region. So I won't read the numbers there, but particularly what I'm proud of is 2 numbers there. And that first one, or one of those, is 53 of our member municipalities participated in some way in the plan in one of our workshops. And then if you look at the number of other organizations, 175 organizations in total. So we had so many partners who joined us, and I feel like they really wanted the municipalities to succeed and really wanted this to be a regional plan. So we're really pleased with the stakeholder participation that we had. So that stakeholder participation then complements the fundamentals of a climate action plan. And that is, in our case, it's regional data, but it's based on greenhouse gas emissions, as Don mentioned, the mitigation portion of the plan, And then climate adaptation, we have to look at the risks and vulnerabilities that we have. Again, ours was done on a regional level. And so the pie chart shows the greenhouse gas emissions for the region. This is a 2015 assessment that was done by CMAP. And if you look at the blue and the green portions together, 69% of our emissions come from stationary sources, which means it's building energy, including the power sector. So right now, this is the area that we really want to focus on. But the next really biggest piece is transportation emissions. And so our plan reflects that waste and water together is less than 3%. So that's a small piece, but of course we want to address it for other reasons, adaptation as well. And then the fundamental climate risk and vulnerability assessment, we looked at what the threats are to the region, as Don mentioned. It's flooding and extreme heat are the two primary challenges, with drought as a very close second behind that. And so the risks vary across the region. You can see this heat map on the right with risk and vulnerability. Even though we all face similar temperatures across the region, the character of the community and your own, they call it adaptive capacity, but your own living situation, as well as your own personal health and your ability to adapt, alter your risk. And so that's fundamental to the climate risk and vulnerability that we did in creating the plan. And so now the plan is based, again, as Professor Wuebbles said, looking primarily at mitigation or reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. And we have that sharp line there in the middle. The greenhouse gases have been rising and they have to stop, and they have to stop now. There really, as you're hearing from the news with COP, there's no time to waste. But because those emissions will be persistent in the atmosphere for decades to come, we have to adapt. We're feeling impacts of climate change now, and we have to prepare for a rapid change. I didn't work in suffering. I really want to get that into what Don mentioned, but we did root the plan in equity. And so crossing both mitigation and adaptation, it was really important that we kept the focus on the impact on human beings, and that recognizing that there are vulnerable populations for lots of reasons that are going to be disproportionately affected by impacts of climate change, or conversely could benefit or should benefit from investments related to clean energy in addressing greenhouse gas emissions. So the plan is rooted in equity, and those are the components of the plan. And then unique to our region, so if we take this regional approach at what the risks are and the sources of the things that we want to address, the members that I work with are municipal governments. And so this is what's unique about our plan. So while we have these very large challenges, we have to look at what municipalities can do. And remember, they said they're ready to go. We have this Greenest Region Compact Coalition of all these municipalities who want to take action. And so the entire plan is framed around what we call these levers. So municipalities can lead in taking actions on their own. And this means changing their own operations and decisions and investments to address climate change. They can encourage others to do so. And this is really my favorite area to talk about, because when we did the research, we found that there's more on encourage than you really would think. So can you encourage behaviors that are sustainable amongst your constituents? Can you do that with your businesses, the anchor institutions in your own community, and other units of government? So the encourage others to take climate action is surprisingly powerful. And maybe the mayors can address that point or agree with me or not. And the final one is enact. So local codes and policies are where the most power are, but collaborating and expressing support for and asking other legislators at other levels to enact policies that address climate change. So this is the way the plan is framed. And then finally, well, we start with the individuals, and that's the focus of the plan, protecting their well-being. If you look at the graphic here, you can see that there is a strong connection from our local individual actions, our municipal actions, collaborating across the region, and then the impact that we can have at the state, federal level, and finally hoping to do everything that we can to address climate change on a global scale. As Professor Wuebbles said, we all have to work on this together. So I'll move right away into the mitigation portion of the plan, and I have to do the requisite wedge chart. So bear with me while I try to explain. This is the result of modeling that we use. This was a tool provided to us through the Global Covenant of Mayors based on the greenhouse gas inventory. So this is where we do our, we actually had an engineering firm do all the math for us and do the modeling. But if you look at the colored, the column on the left, those are the areas that we found and actions that we could take around them. So this is all addressing stationary energy, transportation energy, and water and waste. But starting to explain now what that wedge chart looks like. So if you look on the y-axis or the upright axis, that's CO2 emissions equivalent per year in million metric tons. And where we're at right now is 119 million metric tons. And this is based in 2015. And we've had some look at the chart and say, why are emissions rising? Because we have to factor in a population growth. And so this is where the regional planning agencies said this is what the population growth are. And based on current trends, we know that the emissions are going to increase. And where we're going with this is to push down to net zero emissions by 2050. And so that fattest part of the wedge is where we need to take action, and the timeline along the bottom is how quickly we need to act. So what I want to point out is, as I said, energy power sector is the biggest source of emissions in our region. So that widest wedge, that's a deep blue in the middle, is the power sector. And I'll go into some of these a little bit more, but I wanted to point out some of them which are both alarming and then somewhat disheartening. So if you take, for example, where I spent a lot of my career in urban forestry and green infrastructure, that is the yellow bar, that's sequestration. It's actually a very tiny impact. And this is the models that we have and the data that we have. I know that this is not perfect because of the data and the models that we have. But it does show that while planting trees is going to be important, we really can't count on it a lot to sequester carbon. Transportation, that light blue wedge, which is where I'll talk a little bit more about it, is where we can spend more time. So I'll move on from this one, and hopefully any questions that are coming up in your mind will make a little bit more sense as I move through the objectives. But what I want to point out here is this question that you really queued up, Donna, and this is needed innovation. So if you'll notice, the 80% targeted 2050 is what we can model. So everything that we know and can demonstrate through science says that we can get to just a little bit better than 80% emissions reductions by 2050. But we set the target of net zero emissions anyway, because we know that there's an opportunity for innovation and have to be optimistic that we'll get there. It's also possible that that improves over the next cycle of doing this plan, but at this cut with the resources that we have, we just couldn't find a path to net zero emissions. So with that, we did set this goal of net zero emissions. We set interim targets, as you could see on with the wedge sheet earlier, or the wedge graph, with the end target in 2050 of 80% emissions reductions. The biggest reduction is the 2030 emissions, which we expect to see 50% emissions reductions, and that is pretty consistent with what you'll see other plans doing. So we think at the beginning it'll happen quickly. Mitigation objectives then are arranged around the areas that we have to address. But one that we didn't have on the graph, because you can't model it, is the demonstrating leadership to reduce emissions. And this is really everything that the mayors in the region are doing, can do, and want to do. But we can't trace those. Some enabling actions is what they're called, back to direct emissions reduction. So this is doing the groundwork. And there are strategies associated with each of these in the plan. Decarbonize energy sources, which means that we clean up the power sector. Optimize building energy means both we use less energy and then switch to carbon-free sources like electricity. Implement clean energy policies. This is separated out because these can be so powerful, including at the local level. Decarbonize transportation means that we get rid of the internal combustion engine. Reduce vehicle miles traveled means that we find other ways to get around that are more sustainable and cleaner, particularly transit and active transportation. Manage water and waste sustainably. These are lumped together, but that's just because they have to be for the amount of impact that they have. And then finally, sustain ecosystems to sequester carbon. And that means nature-based solutions. So to explain the plan, and again, way too much to get into lots of details, but I'll go through one objective and one set of strategies related to decarbonized transportation. And so this is what a portion of the plan looks like in the framework. This is the detailed strategies. And looking at one particular strategy, because this is one that we have a lot of interest in, we have a strong proposal for, we think we are going to have a program to address this early next year. And that is to adapt development processes to accelerate investment in EV charging infrastructure. This is making municipalities ready for EV charging investment in their communities by getting codes and policies aligned for this new technology. So the municipal role, if you look at the column, is enacting these policies. Then the rest of the chart looks at helping a municipality evaluate impact and risk. So the solution status sounds a little geeky, but what that means is this a technology or a practice that's proven? If that's the, if it's low risk, in other words, we know this will work. The greenhouse gas emissions reduction potential, then looking at this puts into words what the charts say. And then cost and effort required is just, again, to help plan and evaluate. Well, I can't put it on this, all this on the chart. Each strategy also comes with equity considerations, partners that are needed, outcomes, and co-benefits. So on the adaptation side, this is arranged differently, but we use the term adaptation and resilience interchangeably. But resilience means we're adapting to climate change, but resilience means, you've heard this in the news, it's build back better. So when there is an episode or a shock, they call it, communities are prepared to not lose ground, but to come back stronger. And that requires planning and investment. So this is the concept of resilience. And so that plan, for the plan, we have to tie this back to the climate risks and hazards that I talked about in the beginning. And so each objective then is framed around the impacts that we're expecting and how they will impact what we care about, the assets and the people that we care about. So that's why there are 3 related to heavy precipitation: flooding in homes, flooding and transportation, stormwater and infrastructure. So we organize all of the strategies around these. So health, heat and health, air quality and flooding, and public health, and then drought and water supply. And the goal here is, I don't want to call it not science-based because we don't have the metrics that go along with this, but we look at the processes that need to align for reaching that resilience. And the climate adaptation goal is persistent, equitable climate adaptation with interim targets. First, looking at climate resilient governance, getting our own act together in our own jurisdictions. By 2040, collaborating across jurisdictions for resilience, and then finally achieving cohesive, resilient communities by 2050. And adaptation objectives, this was really interesting for us. Again, these are tailored for local governments, and these were, through research, determined to be both achievable and powerful. And what I found very heartening is that these are within the toolbox of municipalities. So adaptation is not something we don't know how to do, because we know how to educate and engage our communities. We just need to do it around climate resilience and adaptation. Incorporate equity and inclusion into climate adaptation efforts. Again, something that municipalities know how to do, but we all need to focus on. Collaborate and build capacity. Enact plans and policies focused on adaptation and resilience. And then finally, the really powerful one and big one is adapt operations and investments for future climate conditions. And I won't go into the details of the strategies just to stay within the time, but again, there are some 50 strategies specific for this, like the mitigation portion that you can find in the plan. And then in closing, I'll just talk about the next steps for the Climate Action Plan, or CAP. And that is, we're in the phase right now where we're supporting municipal engagement. And currently, for the municipalities that are hearing from their constituents that they would like to take climate action, we're giving them opportunities to support the goals of the climate action plan. We're collecting resolutions just launched this in September, where communities can do the same style of resolution that they did for the Greenest Region Compact. So we can say how many communities are on board with the emissions reductions targets. We will update the Greenest Region Compact, our earlier tool, to mesh with the climate action plan, so that that same clever checklist that the Greenest Region Compact framework will be updated with prioritized climate actions. And we're raising funds and fostering partnerships so we can do that now. So I hope that will happen in the next year or two, that we'll have a tracking and reporting tool for municipalities to report local actions so that we can tie that up into regional reporting as well. And then finally, this is what we've been doing, want to continue to do, and will accelerate, is regional scale implementation, including projects that we have. One of the well-known ones is Soul Smart, where communities have aligned their codes and processes to accelerate solar development. And I think Mayor Craig might talk about that. Hanover Park was active in Soul Smart. And then other regional scale implementation, including residential energy efficiency, transportation, and electric vehicle preparedness for communities, or EV readiness. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to some questions.
Thank you, Edith. I think we're going to hold Edith's questions. I think it might benefit us all if we listen to Mayor Craig's talk, because then we've got kind of the general, and then we'll have a specific community, and then we'll have Mayor Polesky speak, and then we'll take questions for all three speakers. Mayor Craig had an engagement at last minute, and so he has sent a video of his remarks. So we're going to be watching Mayor Craig on a video, and I think Edith and David will handle the questions at the end. And take it away, Mayor Craig, on video. Thank you.
International City County Management Association and the Solar Foundation. Hanover Park commits to a 3-day review of all completed building permit applications for installation of solar energy systems. In addition to achieving gold level designation, Hanover Park received the 2018 Soul Smart Special Recognition Award for demonstrating solar excellence in inspections. The award celebrates and shines a light on communities that have gone above and beyond by earning at least 60% of the total points available in one or more of the 8 Soul Smart categories of permitting, planning, zoning, and development, construction codes, solar rights, utility engagement, community engagement, and marketing, development, and finance. The Villages program has revamped our solar permitting process in inspectional services. The Village has received a national award recognition for the program with honorable mention award by the U.S. Conference of Mayors Climate Protection Awards. In the first year, Hanover Park went from 4 solar permits to 55. To date, we have a total of 215 solar permits worth a total value of $3 million. Our residents know that Hanover Park is open for solar business. I'm proud, our residents are proud, and we're on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Polesky, would you like to share anything that Roselle is doing or plans to do, or any questions for Edith regarding the community of Roselle?
For October 21st.
Yeah, absolutely.
7 p.m.
I need to make it go away. Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Would do the roll call.
Absolutely.
I'm
Trustee
sure it's an
Bickford?
exciting meeting too that they're having.
It must be.
Trustee Husani?
I apologize. Make it go away,
Trustee
please.
Porter?
Here,
And
Trustee
it
Kemper.
won't.
please join.
There we go. So no, appreciate the League of Women Voters hosting this event. So the community of Roselle has a lot of things that we've been working on and continuing to develop in terms of building our sustainability in town. back in 2019, before the pandemic started, we kicked off an Envision Roselle plan that looked at the village's future, looking out 50 years. And this was the most ambitious endeavor we had taken, because normally we look at smaller time periods, but a lot of things, including the environmental issues that we're dealing with, these need longer plans. This is going to take a generational effort to solve. And so as a part of that, we identified through public input as well as elected official guidance that we wanted to have a resilient community. And we also identified sustainability as a value that's going to be core and a focus for us as a community going forward as we start to watch the community evolve and develop. And so, as a mayor, as someone who's of the millennial generation, as someone who is a gardener, but also as someone who's a new father, this is really important to me that we tackle, because I don't want to pass this on to my daughter or and her family to solve this issue. And so from the village's standpoint, we've started to embark on a 30-year reforestation plan. And so planting trees isn't going to solve our problem by any means. And it's not something that we, think is going to make us be, rest on our laurels and move on, but it does help us replace a lot of losses we had, especially with the emerald ash borer. And what we did is we wanted to be resilient in thinking about what is the future of our environment going to be. Temperatures are changing, and so the species of trees that we plant needs to evolve. Otherwise, we could have mass die-offs like we've seen over the past couple decades. And so we had a forester go in and actually select the appropriate species for each area in the village, so that way we're planting trees that fit the physical environment, but also the future environmental conditions that we expect, which should reduce our burden and cost maintaining our trees in the long term, as well as providing relief from the heat island effect, helping absorb extra rain runoff that will continue to occur as the weather patterns change, and allow us to really make sure that we're having that sustainable ecosystem within the town. We've also approached a lot of our things with flooding. And so we've been investing a lot of money in doing additional studies to evaluate where we have issues in stormwater management. We have forecasted that we need to spend tens of millions of dollars over the next decade alone, let alone the long-term future, to help us better manage it. And a lot of this is because our old modeling data is irrelevant today. As has been brought up earlier on this call, the volume that storms produce, the amount of storms that we have, it's putting pressure on our current system. And for a community that's proudly celebrating its centennial next year, we have a lot of infrastructure that's aging that needs to be upgraded. And so this upcoming year, we'll be doing a lot of public input sessions to help us understand what's the best way for us to bridge those budget gaps, because it's a huge impact for our municipalities to undertake and to deal with. As a part of that, we see this as how we work with redevelopment agreements, or RDAs. We've had a number of developments in town, and I know a lot of times that sparks a lot of debate, but there's a lot of things that the village is doing to be proactive on these matters instead of allowing things to kind of be business as usual. So we had a recent high density development going on East Irving Park. We're in the process of having a large community developed near the train station. We have townhomes being developed on our western edge, and each of these has very stringent water management requirements. We now require all new developments of this scale to have vaults, and that's essentially a concrete tank that's underground that helps us absorb water and then slowly release it to our system so we don't over capacity our ability to process it. And that's something that we do to not only improve conditions for the entire community, but to make ourselves more resilient in the long term. It's a lot easier to invest in this and to require our private partners to go in and do the extra effort now to save our community a lot of damage and heartache down the road. And so in some sense, while development sometimes is seen as a negative contributor to our climate situation, we're looking at density in particular to help make sure that we can have a community that promotes less car mobile traffic. And it's going to take time. The suburbs were never meant to be a place where it's very walkable, but that's something that we're trying to do. And density is something that we will have to embrace if we want to really see a lot of these goals articulate. Metro 19, which is a very hotly debated development, is a transit-oriented development. And this is something that in planning circles is used to help minimize the usage of vehicles on the road and encourage people to make use of public transportation. Within walking distance, residents would be able to get on the Metro to go to a number of communities for work or even go downtown to the Loop. And so as we continue to look and invest in our community, we want to find the right development that's going to not only help our community grow, but grow in a smart way that promotes better practices because as you have more density, more population in these confined spaces, you're going to have more businesses come in, more services that then those residents don't have to get in their car, they can walk. And while those are long-term goals and it's very difficult to guarantee or to incentivize that kind of development, that's been the approach that the board has taken over the past couple of years to help our community continue to institute these values in our work. Mayor Craig talked about Soul Smart, and we're a little bit further behind than Hanover Park, but we are leading and following their example. And so we're a bronze Soul Smart community. We're on our way to earning our Soul Smart Silver status, and so gold is absolutely within reach and something that we're working to achieve. And like he had said, this is a way for us to be partners and make sure our ordinances and our code allows people to do things that they can do privately to help us reduce this impact on our community. We're really proud to be home to Lake Park High School, that at least at the time of installation was the largest public installation of solar in Illinois. And that's something that's a point of pride for us. And we want to learn and continue to develop and work with our different government agencies to promote those kinds of practices. And I think there's a lot of things that we can continue to do in that regard, and it's something that's budding for us. And I think finally, we're looking at other opportunities to engage in electrical charging stations and looking at that model. That's something that's a big gap in our area. You see it a lot in those bigger commercial corridors like Woodfield, near Stratford and other areas like that. But in the suburbs, there's a lot of spots that are kind of missing, and we're working and engaging with partners. I think there's a lot of opportunities from a private standpoint with grants being available at the federal and state level. And so we're working to figure out the right ideas. And as we have new development, that's an opportunity for us to invest in those next generation technologies, because while we're doing work, it's a lot more cost effective for us to tackle those issues. And I think the one thing I would add, just to wrap it up before we get to the questions, is we're also reevaluating the way that we do business. And so recently we joined essentially a consortium of public works agencies across the county. And the reason we do that is so that we can share resources. As storms increase, there's going to be more demand for recovery in those events. And so we were happy and proud to send our employees to help clean up the tornadoes that happened in the southern part of the county. And by joining groups like this, we can share resources. And that way, instead of us all investing money and having duplicate equipment and services, we can now share that as a community. And that way we can be more smart in allocating it, but also understanding we're going to need to be able to respond to these events at a moment's notice. And it's very difficult for us to all of us to build up to staff at those levels. And so we're doing things to collaborate with our surrounding communities so we can continue to provide high level services. So.
Thank you, Mayor Pileski. I think I'm going to take a first question. It's not directed to anyone in particular, so maybe Edith, you can answer it first, and then Mayor Polesky, if you would like to add something, that'd be great. Our first question is from Wayne Donkey. He says, I love electrical things, but I'm concerned about how the electricity is generated. How can we replace fossil fuels and still keep up with what might be a large increase in electric power needs? Edith, you're muted.
Yeah, I just noticed that. I'll start on that one, and that's a good question. In order to integrate all of these demands, we really need to, for electricity, and we have to really worry about peaks. And one of the things that some of you may know is that when renewable energy, particularly solar, is generating, it peaks at a time when maybe we don't have as much of off-takers. So what you don't have the consistency with renewable energy across the time frame, and it's harder to turn it on, turn it off. So to manage that on a very large grid scale is something called beneficial electrification and smart grid. So the utilities are looking ahead to how can you store energy, and how can we manage those peaks and valleys over the day. One of the things that they're looking at, in addition to just battery storage, is, and this is where there's a symbiosis between electric vehicles and battery storage and the grid. So if there's enough demand for charging electric vehicles, most of that charging is done overnight when there might be excess renewable energy on the grid. And so you're in a way storing that electricity in those vehicles. And if, again, that's done at scale, that is something that helps even out these peaks and valleys. So, and there's at a utility scale, there's distributed generation, which a property owner can have a system that is more self-sufficient where you're storing electricity for what you might have generated on your rooftop during the day. You can see that scale up as well, but it is something that the utilities need to manage, but it's not unachievable. There also has to be a mix of all of the fuels that are clean that we can count on, including nuclear, in order to make that work. But we can get rid of certainly fossil fuel generated electricity with good management.
Mayor Polesky, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think the one thing I would say is it's really great to make your opinions known on those issues to your state and federal officials. I think, from a municipality standpoint, we will always do our best to ensure that there's as competitive a marketplace as we can, but a lot of those rely on a larger, more regulatory powerhouse that we would be able to provide. So if that's something that's of concern, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to those representatives.
Next question, also from Mr. Domke. Why don't municipal buildings use their flat roofs for more solar? Many companies with huge warehouses are other great locations.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one thing that people probably don't know or have as much visibility to is as a part of a lot of the regulations that are in the state of Illinois, ComEd actually provides free electricity to most municipalities. So it's kind of a dirty secret, but the fact of the matter is a municipality isn't paying for most of their electricity that they use. And so because of that, you've almost disincentivized municipalities to invest money in it, because if we were to do that, we wouldn't receive any savings because we're not paying for electricity to begin with. There are some exceptions. There's certain buildings that don't necessarily qualify and whatnot, but for the vast majority of cases, that's the case. That doesn't make it right, but I think there's also some issues in how do you have a municipality generating power and selling it back to the grid. It's not impossible. That's where you see a lot of companies end up, you lease equipment, but someone else owns it, which takes some of the configuration of that correctly. You need a good attorney, is what I'll put it that way. So it's nothing that I think hasn't necessarily, it's not a barrier to it occurring, but it's definitely something that we should continue to pressure and encourage people to do. Most often, the best time to do it is when a roof is getting replaced, because that takes off a lot of the costs and can be an actual huge savings benefit from a deferred maintenance perspective for a community, because that can help prolong the lifespan of that roof if installed correctly. So good question.
Next question is from
Can
Deb.
I add to that just a little bbit? Excellent response, Mayor Pileski. So that is a frustration with the public sector. But one other thing, just to talk about to separate out what some of the large warehouses and the private buildings, there is an opportunity for financing that is relatively new in Illinois, and it's called CPACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy, and it's new mechanisms for financing that. So the private sector can finance and pay the investment cost, the capital cost for that solar system back over a longer period of time. And the counties are adopting this, relatively new, but we do have it in DuPage County. And I think Cook County might be launched now or is ready to launch. So just wanted to add to that.
Thank you. The next question is from Deborah Halp. She asks, how will CEJA, the Clean Energy Jobs Act, work toward achieving some of the 49 basic sustainability goals?
I'll start with that. So, and CEJA is very focused on energy. So while it's our biggest sector and it's really important to tackle, it's also incredibly progressive legislation that really also has a strong equity focus, looking at a just transition. So it's a great piece of legislation, but it is very, very focused on renewable energy, energy efficiency, and looking at some of the finance mechanisms as well. Then it does address electrification and transportation, but not as broadly in terms of the sustainability goals. And if I didn't say it earlier, sustainability differs from pure climate action in that there's more of a human element to it. So sustainability incorporates strong cohesive communities, access to local food, resilience in a more broad way than the specific targeted climate action will. So CEJA is great, but I would say it's addressing energy and transportation only.
Okay, we have one last question. This is from Jeff Garris. He says, I noticed that Edith's GHG emission charts did not cover embodied energy in goods that we buy and in our food sources. I'm wondering whether we can reduce carbon by shopping for local food at farmers markets and food co-ops, et cetera, and carbon sequestration by forest preserves and other natural areas by restoring our ecosystems, not just planting trees.
Again, I'll start with that one, and Mayor Pileski, please jump in if you want to add to that. So this gets into the limitations of doing the greenhouse gas emissions, and so it's really a matter of scope and scale and budget. That it's not possible to track the embodied carbon in the goods and services, good products that we purchase. So that is a limitation. It doesn't mean that there aren't emissions there. It's just really hard to track it and report on it. So all of those lifestyle choices obviously have benefits. Agriculture is such a huge source of emissions in the region, not to mention that local resilience in supporting local businesses and locally grown food really is important for community resilience and to create a thriving, resilient community. So there's so many benefits in there. Just because it's not in the greenhouse gas emissions inventory doesn't make it not important.
And I think, you bring up how do we protect other ecosystems and invest in kind of beyond just planting trees. I think one thing that we've done is we've taken a more aggressive stance on going in and making sure that our wetlands that we do have are maintained properly. Oftentimes they've been overrun with invasive species, or they've been left to kind of man-made issues that have deteriorated their conditions. So they're not adding the same value of retaining water. They don't have the same species diversity that they would have had, and they're not necessarily doing their ecological job. And so we've actually gone in where we can, and they're very well protected from a DuPage County perspective. However, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're going to be maintained appropriately. And so we've done things where we've required developers to actually allow us the authority to charge the owners at some point, assess a special service area or an SSA fee to ensure if they can't do the job themselves, the village will come in, make sure they do the job correctly, and make sure that it's paid for. So there's no question about funding being available or not for these projects, because oftentimes they're the first in the chopping block when budget issues do come up. And so we've done a lot of work to kind of evaluate and see. There's also some wetland areas that we own. I think one thing that we see as a challenge is oftentimes, depending on the agency, there's not a lot of excitement about taking on new property. And so who owns and who will maintain them in the long term becomes a sticking point that we see. But encouraging those kinds of local behaviors is something that we try to do very much so from a perspective of how do we keep people to eat, shop, work all within the same community to help reduce their consumption and going outside of that cycle. So
I forgot to address the latter part of that question. I apologize, Jeff. But so another shortcoming in the plan was that we didn't have any data on sequestration from landscapes that were not trees. So there was an urban forest assessment done when I worked at the Morton Arboretum with the U.S. Forest Service, and City of Chicago had done it, where carbon sequestration for trees only was measured. But there's a real opportunity there, just saying, that if sequestration in other plants and soils can be very powerful, but there just isn't any data at scale on that. So that might be help us close that innovation gap.
Well, thank you. Our time is up, and I want to thank our distinguished panel of speakers. Thank you too to everyone who joined us tonight, and to those who will view this webinar at a later date. We can't close without asking you to join your local League of Women Voters. The League does great work on a variety of important topics, and we're nonpartisan. You'll be warmly welcomed by our members. To find a league in your area, you can go to www.lwvil.org. Thank you again to all of you. And I think to our panelists, we'll be following up to see what kind of actions League members can take to move this issue forward. Thank you very much.